Good afternoon. Welcome to Conversation with Great Minds, a podcast hosted by Center for Development Studies. This is an initiative to engage with some of the leading economists and gain insights into their economic realities of today.
It is of immense honor and pleasure that we have Professor Maitreesh Ghatak with us for our very first episode. Professor Ghatak is the Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics. He is also the editor of Economica and Ideas for India. After completing his PhD from Harvard University, he has also held positions in the University of Chicago, Yale and Princeton. Professor Ghatak's work broadly focuses on development economics with key contributions to the study of poverty, inequality, institutions, and the role of collective action in addressing these socio-economic challenges. So today we will be dwelling on the problem of inequality. So our first question to you, sir, what are your views on the problem of inequality in India? And do you see poverty and inequality as two forces reinforcing each other, or should we treat them as separate forces? And what are the policy suggestions you would be suggesting to us?
Sure. I think it is well documented, and many people have worked on this in recent years, that there's been an increasing trend in inequality, especially in income and wealth. And Thomas Piketty and the World Inequalities Database, they use some methods to come up with cross-country comparisons and also build country panels over time. I think it is reasonable inference from that data, which combines for income the consumer expenditure surveys and attaches that with income tax data to get to overall income inequality measures. So since liberalization, there's been a rising tendency in inequality in income as well as wealth. Consumption inequality, which is just based on the consumer expenditure surveys, which excludes savings and things, there it is much less of a clear pattern, and if anything, there has been a mild decrease in recent years. But there are good reasons to think that these are broadly consistent with overall inequality going up, simply because income inequality also takes into account savings, and the rich tend to save more. So consumption, it is going to be more compressed. And also in this data, the top part of the population in terms of income and overall economic resources, they're systematically excluded by the sampling thing of this consumer expenditure service. So what is happening to the very top, say 10%, 5%, 1%, 0.05%, that is always something that one has to do a lot of extra kind of investigation to try to get a sense of that. So inequality has been generally rising. And also in India's case, even if you take a cross-country comparison, there are few other countries where inequality is also rising sharply, such as Brazil and South Africa. But even by comparison of peer economies, in India's case, inequality has been rising. How much, to what degree, these are all matters of what measures you use. So that's the first part of kind of the answer to your question. The second is what's happening to poverty, are they related, etc. So as we all know, that inequality is a relative measure. So you can either compute the Gini coefficient, or you can compute the share of the top 10% relative to the share of the bottom 50%. These are some of the statistics people use. You could have a reasonably well-to-do economy where even the poorest are living under reasonable conditions, and yet there is inequality, and that could be increasing over time. Now in India's case, poverty has been a bit of a debated topic, partly because of paucity of data until recently, because as everybody knows that the household expenditure data based on which it is computed, that survey wasn't available up to 21, 11, 12, until very recently. Over literally the last 12 months or 13 months, we now actually have 2 rounds of household consumer expenditure surveys, and people have been analyzing it. I am part of it along with my co-author Rishabh Kumar on these things, but there are Himanshu and Srijit Mishra and many others, Mahendra Dev, Rangarajan, they have all commented on this, and there are many others. So I think with poverty, again, there is some evidence that it has gone down since 21, 11, 12, and frankly, it would have been surprising if it didn't, because even if you look at all the eras, decadally poverty tends to go down, right, because of general economic growth, some wages, opportunities. But the question is how much, right? And whether we are using the right poverty lines to measure it. This is where I will not necessarily get into great details, but in our recent work, we are focusing a lot on prices and to what degree the way we are measuring poverty, which takes a certain monetary value as to what would afford you a minimum food and basic necessity requirement, which is the Tendulkar method. And then, of course, there's the World Bank $3 per person per day measure that you convert in purchasing power parity terms to convert into what it means in rupee terms. And the best way to ask it is, suppose you just have that money in your pocket and you have to live in a given day either in the city or in a rural area, right? What would that afford you, whether you can survive and be physically fit to do the activities that you have to do? So here I would say the current state of the debate is it has gone down, but how much is still to be determined. And the only resolution to this would happen when we have an updated poverty measure that looks at the current consumption bundle of the poor based on this household detailed surveys in a very similar way to Tendulkar and Rangarajan and the others who previously calculated the poverty lines and updated, because over time dietary patterns change, people, new goods and services come in, so people make substitutions. These days, even the very poor need to have some basic access to mobile phones and things, and all this would be competing for relatively, scarce resources. So that would be my broad take on inequality and poverty in India. Policy implication is a huge question, and I could go, talk about them in great detail, but perhaps one can focus on specific policies and have a very general discussion.
So when we talk about structural inequality, one of the important perspectives, especially in the rural areas, is land massification. So what are your views on the role of land reforms in reducing rural inequality, and can rural insurance help in that case?
Yeah, I think that even right now, even though agriculture's contribution to GDP has gone down quite a bit, so it would be around 15%, plus minus a few percentage points, depending on which year you're measuring. But about 50% of the population depend, on agriculture or natural resources, broadly defined, the primary sector for their living. So clearly, agriculture has a big role in our economy as far as the relatively poor are concerned. I would say early in my career, I worked specifically on land reform and tenancy reform in the context of West Bengal, and of course Kerala is another state where land reform happened even earlier. I would say that yes, land reform has its role, but realistically speaking, the central laws guide how much surplus land you can take away, and all that would happen or happened in Kerala and West Bengal, where the state governments, rigorously enforce them. So that is why there have been leaders in this. But the laws would restrict you. However well-intentioned you are in this respect, you would not be there. Legal challenges would stop, going beyond that. I would say also one cannot forget that given the overall state of the economy and where things are going, agriculture will shrink over time. So while land reform, is something that has a lot of, say, maybe resonance from political movements and farmers and their various demands that have defined India's political landscape, I would not necessarily consider that to be the lowest hanging fruit if we were to go at structural inequality. I would say education, health, and job opportunities, both in the sort of service sector and the manufacturing sector, that is where it is. And it doesn't have to be a very academic or theoretical point. If you go to surveys in the villages, if you ask a poor person, what does that person do? Maybe he's a small farmer, maybe it's a tenant or agricultural laborer. Everybody would want their children to move out, right? And that clearly is different from, say, 50 years ago, when the whole goal would be, they would ideally stay within agriculture and the rural area, but have better facilities. So that, I think, is also something to keep in mind.
Okay, so can microfinance programs like joint liability lending be made more dynamically efficient with the right institutional design? Or are these programs also subject to the risk of indebtedness?
I think both are true. I mean, clearly if you think about the Andhra Pradesh crisis that happened in 2010 and that led to, stopping of microfinance activities in the state temporarily, and then it was resumed. Both are true, in the sense that, see, credit is a necessary thing. All of us need it one way or the other. Whether you're buying a house, whether you're buying a car, EMIs, or whether just to make your ends meet, by the 25th of the month, you're cash short and you need some money to tide over to go to the next month. So I don't think we need to look at credit as something necessarily insidious. It is as much as insurance is a need. Credit is a need that will, even in a relatively equal and prosperous society, there will always be time variation in your income and consumption flows that will not be synchronized, so therefore you would need that. So that's the need. But then the market structure and the institutions determine how the actual outcomes happen. So this excessive borrowing, which microfinance led to, which is what led to some suicides and very bad press for some of the microfinance institutions, that is real. But we can think about credit cards and how credit card companies push credit cards, and this is not just even unique to India, right? It's everywhere. And then people who all are subject to either various, economic crisis in a given moment where you have to take loans. But there are also other things, like maybe there are social kind of status-driven things that you need to have a certain expenditure for a marriage of the child, and then you borrow to do that, and that then puts you in a bit of a debt cycle. So I would say, therefore, like pretty much any other market, even if it's a necessary sort of service, we should acknowledge it. We shouldn't demonize necessarily, credit as something, inherently problematic. Because when you say moneylender, in a lot of our kind of, literary or cultural associations, that often has a slightly kind of negative aspect to it. I do think that we should take a more modern outlook towards it, like credit and insurance. These are all important things, and they're not the same, of course. But market regulation and essentially protecting the borrower from certain predatory practices, I think that is what would be needed. Now, how that will be done, what is the political support for that, what is the regulatory kind of mechanism that would sort of enforce that, these are big questions to which we cannot, sort of readily answer.
And we know that inequality is now becoming a politically charged issue, and reforms like tax reforms are getting a sharper focus.
Mm-hmm.
So, what are your views on tax reform as a policy to reduce inequality, and how can it be done without having a political backlash? Can it be done?
No, it cannot be. Look, any economic policy in which there are winners and losers, it cannot be done without conflict. Whether it's farm support prices or subsidies to specific, groups, right, that they benefit, or even we have been following debates about the poor have become dependent on handouts, and that even though I think generally speaking there's sympathy, at least on large parts of the political spectrum about the extreme poor. But even there, we have this idea that somehow the middle class is paying taxes and the poor are only getting benefit. So that is true in every place and every time, that there is a zero-sum aspect to this. Somebody's gain is somebody's loss, right? I think, therefore, tax policy should be transparent and fair, right? And I would say that is the order of the day. So in other words, rather than directly saying that, look, we're going to impose this big taxes, you'll have immediate reactions and people will raise legitimate questions about what will be the efficiency of expenditure on this. And we, even as ordinary taxpayers, we would feel that this is what we are paying. These are the conditions of the roads or public services. And that's a legitimate consideration, right? I would say the two areas in which, we certainly need to think about taxing corporates and capital gains in a way that is more at par with labor income, right? Because, it's the classic thing. If you get the same salary or same amount of money as salary, say a high-paid job in the IT sector, but if instead you're an investor and you're only gaining dividend payments out of your investments, the tax implications are going to be very different, right? So of course these are capital and labor income are not identical. There are sort of things about incentives and all of that. But I still believe, and based on my academic kind of knowledge or understanding of public economics too, that fundamentally the more transparent and equal the tax system. So suppose you have a house that you're renting out. Suppose your parents left you a house, you're renting it out. That income should be taxed at the same rate in terms of the money, because money is money, right? It is coming to your annual income, and that should be the same as the money you would have paid if you were, say, a lecturer in a college, right? So that would be my general take on it.
So your recent works have had a critical perspective on business hypothesis. So could you please walk us through your thoughts and what do you think contribute to this divergence?
Right, that's a very good question, and indeed, I think that the work that I presented here very recently, as well as I've been kind of working in the last decade or so, I think that again it's not unique to me. A lot of people, even Piketty's work, and his co-authors, have raised questions about, the Kuznets curve, which was supposed to say that as initially growth happens, inequality goes up because those who are better positioned to take economic opportunities, advantage of them, they will benefit, right? And the more skilled people will benefit. But eventually there will be an upward pressure on wages through the labor market because of the various multiplier effects, that the more, say, there's an IT boom, say, immediately there will be some people who will benefit, will get high salaries, and whatever the companies will make profits. But then all kinds of ancillary services and small businesses will crop up, which is natural with this process, and there will be demand for those kinds of jobs too, right? That will be supporting that ecosystem, and that was the Kuznets hypothesis, right? I mean, broadly speaking, migration and other ways in which basically the growth impulses will be spreading toward the economic kind of system. But I would say that again, based on the limited evidence that we have from very aggregated statistics, it's a reasonable hypothesis to offer. And when I say a hypothesis to offer, which means it potentially is falsifiable. So therefore, this is a way of saying that we don't know, but it's a reasonable conjecture to make that rather than having a process where essentially economic development spreading to different parts so that people are catching up with the next economic class that was above them, and there's a kind of virtuous upward mobility across the board, right? Rather than that happening, what we are seeing are signs of, you could say, economic kind of segregation, namely, or certain classes are doing reasonably well, right? And our GDP ranking in the global economy, right? This is not just a statistical artifact. I've looked at the numbers, but in terms of our ranking, our population was pretty large all through the last 30, 40 years. or even 50 years, as much as you can go back. So just you having a big population doesn't explain why our ranking improved, right? So clearly that means certain groups have done well, and that is showing up in various other indicators of Indians taking foreign vacations and buying property abroad and all of that. But the question is, how big is this group, right? And that clearly is the question. And the question is, what opportunities are there for mobility? So the ideal story would be that somebody who may be coming from a poor background, whether from rural areas or urban areas, we often see those feel-good stories about the dad being an auto driver and the daughter took an exam or whatever, got into an engineering college. And I think it is universally considered to be a good thing, whatever your ideology or economic views, that where you see that this is exactly how economic development in the end is an abstract concept. You can construct GDP, but that also is a very tricky concept, right? The way we saw in some of the presentations, right? How you exactly measure it, what you consider, like unpaid household work versus not, all kinds of subtleties are there. But subject to that, to me, economic development to the ordinary people, if you ask, say, suppose you could explain to a person on the street, suppose you're auto driver or the car driver, that India is doing well. Now GDP probably you wouldn't be able to explain very well. HDI indices also would be a bit abstract. I mean, you could just say, okay, population is maybe getting better in health and education. But what that person would understand is job opportunities and wages or earnings. That people will understand because it's basic, right? And at some level, what we are doing for the whole economy is the aggregation of these literally billions of individuals as to how the economy is sort of doing. And this is where these growth impulses needs to transmit to these other groups. If not, they are getting economically ghettoized. So it doesn't mean that their standard of living is not improving at all or poverty is not going down at all, but still the hope for a better future for them within their lifetime. Yeah, and better by that all of us mean, if we were to ask any of us, I'm now maybe too old to contemplate a much better future, but for a young person, that wherever you are, you want to sort of move ahead in life, you want to have sort of better income, better, housing and all of that. That's a natural human need, life cycle need, right? Question is that spreading to these sort of groups? And by existing numbers, that doesn't appear to be happening very much. If it was, you could still have inequality, but a highly mobile economy. And that's a very different story. There you could say that even from the poorer sections, those who have skills, those who have talent, those who are working hard, they are landing good jobs. Inequality may still exist, but in that economy, you could almost make a case that yes, it exists and we should have policies to provide sort of a safety net, and that is for a more humane and kind of more ethical point of view, right? And that is where one can debate how much and what. But at least we could say that look, everybody is having a shot in the economic success story. So I think the real question, and economists have been working on it in India, and Raj Chetty has been doing this work in the US. I think that is really where we should also focus on. Because poverty is a reality, and certain deprivations are a reality, whichever point of view you're coming from, and whether you put in caste there, whether you put in condition of women, these deprivations and the historical persistence in this, that is a reality, right? The question is the changes, where, it's like in the stock market, what you see is what's rising and what's falling, right? I think therefore if we have more upward mobility, that would be definitely a good thing across the economy, and that might, again, inequality theoretically could go up or down, even in a highly mobile society, right? But these are very different realities. Some people, in fact, Miles Korak and others, they have worked on this, cross-country stuff, and what is called there's a Gatsby curve. The Great Gatsby curve. The main idea is that highly unequal societies seem to have lower mobility, and this is something a lot of people have been working on. Recently, I saw a paper by Devraj Ray and Garan Janiko. It's a recent paper, But I think that is maybe where some of our debates and discussions should focus on. Poverty will always be important because it's a very basic deprivation. Similarly, inequality is something that we all instinctively understand, so the discussion will be there too. But maybe we should also, focus some of our sort of, eyesight on those metrics too.
So finally, what lessons do you think India can draw from other countries? Will we have an equitable India in 10, 20 years, or what do you think we can do to ensure that we are on the right path?
This is a difficult question, my honest and short answer would be I don't know. But if you want me to elaborate a bit on this, I think one of the things that I have been persuaded by some of my professional colleagues, such as Karthik Muralidharan, who has recently written a book on the Indian economy, is states can learn from each other. So leave aside other countries, we can learn from them too. Of course, there's always scope for learning. But even within India, Kerala has been a leader in certain things. When we grew up studying economic development, Kerala was always considered an outlier because of better education and health measures. So surely there's something to learn from that, right? Similarly, other states, maybe Gujarat is considered to be a dynamic state, Maharashtra largely because of Bombay. And there's maybe something to learn from that, because if you have more industry, more job creation, that clearly will have a positive impulse. And similarly, West Bengal did rural reforms well in the 70s and 80s, the panchayat and those things, and that did, create a certain, uplift in the standard of living. But after that, of course, it has stagnated, and that we would then have to get into state-specific issues. So I would say there's a scope for learning, for what different states are doing, both in delivery of public services as well as economically, what models are they adopting to, essentially foster more investment and job creation, right? And as to equity, again, I would say left to its own device, I don't think the economic engine is showing too much promise that eventually it'll all even out, right? So I would say, therefore, we should split it up in two questions. One is very immediate, which is how do we ensure that we don't have malnutrition, we don't have undernourishment, we don't have deprivation of a very abject kind, and that, again, I'm focusing on economics here, but that also involves gender issues as well as caste, community, and things. I think people having a certain kind of minimum standard of living and a certain dignity of how they lead their lives. And Amartya Sen has formalized some of this, and and I think that is actually very important, because economic development is not just money is important, but for all of us, I think how we are, and that is Sen's capability theory. I think that is absolutely important. So if we split up the questions, I think the priority should really be, what are we doing to those who, need, the most, or those who are in most need in all dimensions. And again, it's not just money, because public services are important too. Suppose your income is considerably above the poverty line, but you cannot access good health care. Yeah? That is a deprivation, and how would you compare that person with somebody whose money is less, but at least gets decent health care? So I think that should be first priority. And the second priority, I would say, in terms of inequality and how because see, in the debates about inequality, there is always this kind of good inequality and bad inequality. Now, of course, good inequality is a provocative term, right? But the point is, somebody who's working harder, somebody who's working, say, 14 hours a day and earning more, even if you're coming from a very left political spectrum, you would have to allow for the fact that nobody is saying everybody should have equal income, because that would absolutely destroy work incentives, skill acquisition, and all of that, right? So some amount of inequality, to the extent it reflects work and talent and all of that, that I think is not an issue. The problem is inheritance of privilege, and how come some people, which might include those in this room, including myself, is we got better opportunities than perhaps somebody who had core sort of abilities that were not very different. That is the kind of equality of opportunity that I think is always desirable, And I think, again, I would say, I would hope across the political or policy spectrum, people should agree on the fact that, that everybody who's sort of born with a certain set of skills and abilities and preferences, right, they get a similar opportunity. So therefore, it might sound very prosaic and even boring, but health and education therefore are extremely important, because that's what a kid born today or whatever recently, that is what's going to determine what this kid is going to do 20 years later, and whether it's a boy or a girl, whether it's a low caste, upper caste, whether it's a religious minority versus, all of that. I think those are the things in which we should focus on, because otherwise I do worry. It's a bit like, look, global warming is happening, right? But it's too big a problem to suddenly come up with a solution that we could implement within, eventually it will have to be, and countries are already moving. So I also think that inequality reflects many, many decades or generations of inequality. There's a cumulative process. So without very, very radical reforms which are politically not really looking likely, that's not going to be combated in a given day. Where one could do sort of a lot of work, right, is basically ensuring greater mobility and more equal opportunity. And that is where I would very much hope, and it's my sincere belief, that people across the political parties, across the ideological spectrum, that we agree on a common set of issues here. How to do it, whether we should decentralize more, whether we should use incentives, or whatever it is, our public sector model, those debates should take place. But in terms of whatever our vision for the country is, and there may be many dimensions to it, but this core vision that we should try to create a better opportunity society for everybody who's in the society, so that it also, I think, other than us feeling good about it in terms of out of our, of course, a commitment to see the country do well, it's also going to be instrumentally good, because having a very deprived section, for again reasons that are well known, whether it's the demand channel, whether it's the supply of skills, even instrumentally, even if you're not thinking in terms of the more the humane reason why you want this, there's also a practical or instrumental reason. So even if suppose you're a business person whose only interest is to the business to do well, you still would want demand for your goods and services, you want a reliable workforce and all of that. So that would be my kind of limited description of what should be a common minimum agenda across the political spectrum.
Well, that was a very enriching and thought-provoking session. We are very grateful for your time. We would like to thank Professor C. Hiramani, the Director of CDS, Dr. Amartya Paul, the Faculty Coordinator of the Placement Cell, and Emmanuel Sir for his continued support and encouragement.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure visiting the CDS, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.